Ever wanted to build your own custom machine learning or AI model, but don't know how to code? Join the club. Well, in this video, we're going to do just that. We're going to use a combination of both Levity and Bubble to build our own custom machine learning model. Now, this is going to be a text-based machine learning model that'll be able to predict the sentiment analysis of some data that we give it. In our example today, I'm going to take a list of customer reviews from an e-commerce store, and then I'm going to train our model to predict if any future reviews have a positive, negative, or neutral sentiment rating. And of course, we're not going to stop there. When it comes to using Bubble, your boy here always loves to take it to the next level. So after we train our machine learning model and integrate it into Bubble, we're going to create an admin dashboard for an e-commerce store that allows a store owner to filter through all of their new reviews that they receive based on their sentiment rating. So that way the store owner knows which reviews to prioritize. Look, there's so much that I want to cover throughout this tutorial. So let's grab our Bubble editor and we can dive right into it. Within our tutorial today, there's going to be quite a few steps that we're going to cover, but of course, like always, I'm going to be sure to explain everything I can in as much detail as possible. And to help us stay on track with where we are throughout our build, I've created this Notion checklist here, which just covers all of the steps that I'm going to walk us through in our tutorial today. And what I personally just love about Notion is that it allows me to just create a checklist of items that I can tick off as I add them into our build. And of course, I'll be sure to include a link to this doc within the description of this video, so that way you can create a copy of this template. But the very first thing I want to cover at the very top of my list here is just walking us through the data set we're going to be using for our machine learning model today. And then of course, once we understand how that's built, we can then go ahead and upload that into our platform of choice, which I'll be covering in a moment. But if you're familiar with AI in any shape or form, you'll understand that it ingests just a large amount of data and then can find common trends or anomalies within that data. And from there, that's how it can automate repeatable processes, because once it identifies these trends, it can start to get a clear concept of how it should perform. And so that's why you'll often hear how important it is to have accurate, well-structured data whenever you're training a machine learning model. And instead of making you find your own custom data set, today I've taken the time to source one for you. And as you'll see, I've included a link to this data set within our Notion doc, but I'll also include a link in the description of this tutorial. But essentially, this data set is just going to be a zip file that I just have stored within a Google Drive here. So you can just download this, and then from there you can easily extract the CSV file that's stored within it. And over in my device here, I actually have taken the time to extract the CSV, and I've just opened this up in a sheet here. But within this data set today, what you'll see is that because we're going to create a sentiment analysis model, I have a large data set that contains a list of product reviews for a women's clothing e-commerce store. And so what you'll find is we have a couple of different columns that are going to store all of the data we're going to use today. One of the main ones is the actual review text itself. So these are all of the free text reviews that people have added, whether they love a product or they had a bad experience with the store. This is where all of that data is going to be contained. And then over on the right-hand side here, what you'll see is there's a column which contains an overall rating. So this will determine if this review was either positive, neutral, or negative. And this is what we're going to use to create what's called the label of our sentiment analysis model. So today in the experience we're going to create, we're going to build a feature within our Bubble app where someone can type in a review for a clothing product. And then that review is going to be sent to our AI model, in which case it's then going to identify if the review was either positive, neutral, or negative. And then from there, our machine learning model is going to spit back the result to our Bubble editor. So that way we can clearly identify what sentiment and overall rating had. And then from there, I'm going to take the time to create an admin dashboard for an e-commerce store, which will allow me to filter all of the reviews based on their sentiment rating. So let's say a customer leaves a bad review. I can easily filter through the negative reviews. And then as a store owner, I can take the time to quickly respond to that in order to triage that problem. And so this is going to be the overall data set we use. So as I've just shown you, it's just going to be in a CSV file. There are, of course, plenty of other data fields, I guess you could call, or columns within our sheet here. but most of these are going to be irrelevant for our machine learning model today. And of course, I'm going to be walking us through the process of how we can classify and label these two main fields here in a moment. But from here, what I'd like to do is actually jump into the platform we're going to be using for our tutorial. And this is where we're going to create our machine learning model. And today my tool of choice is going to be the platform called Levity AI. So if I was to jump over into a browser here, you'll see I'm logged into my Levity AI account. And now Levity is a no-code AI tool. So it allows you to create a completely custom machine learning model without having to write a single line of code. And using Levity, you can create all sorts of cool things like a sentiment analysis model, like we're going to do today. You can create an image recognition model, or in fact, they've even got a whole library of templates that you can leverage here. But today we're going to be creating an AI model from scratch, using, of course, that data set that I've just shown you. Now, you will need to pause this tutorial here and create your own Levity account. Of course, I'll be sure to include a link in the description of this video. And when it comes to creating a Levity account, I should just point out that you will need a business email address. So if you have your own custom domain or website, you're more than likely going to have a custom email address associated with that. Or of course, if you just work at a company, you can use that email address as well. And now, while Levity is a paid product, it does offer a 14-day free trial. So that's going to give us plenty of time to build our AI model here today and experiment with what's possible using a no-code AI tool. And now at this point, if you have signed up for a Levity account, we're going to scroll on down to this button here, which is going to prompt us to create what's referred to as an AI block. And now an AI block is just Levity's way of referring to, I guess you could say, the actual machine learning model. So this is where the brains of your AI model is going to be created. So within a block, it'll allow you to determine what type of machine learning model you want to create. In our case, of course, it's going to be a sentiment analysis model. And then from there, it'll require you to upload your custom data set, from which you'll be then required to label that data. So that way your machine learning model knows which particular information to process. And thankfully, all of this is a super straightforward visual process. Because of course, us no-coders love ourselves some visual programming. And if you're a non-technical person like this guy, it's going to be a super straightforward process. So let's go ahead and create a new AI block here. And the first thing you'll see is that Levity would like us to determine what type of model we want to create. And in our case today, because we're creating a sentiment analysis model that's going to be reviewing text, you probably guessed it by now, but we're going to be selecting the text classifier model. Then from here, we'll be required to give this model a name. So I'm just going to call this reviews sentiment analysis. And then of course, the next step is importing our custom data set. So I'm going to select this here. And this is where we'll be required to upload the CSV file that we had downloaded. And if at any point after this tutorial, you want to continue experimenting with Levity, you'll also find that they have a ton of sample CSVs that you can use if you want to create different types of machine learning models. But in this case today, I'm just going to select the file from my local device here. This file will then just take a little bit of time to upload, but what you'll see is it's giving me a complete visual representation of the data set that I've uploaded here. And it would just like me to confirm that I do in fact have a header row within my CSV. So these are the titles of my columns. And so from here, I'm just going to select the continue button. And within our next step, this is where we'll be required to map out and label our relevant data fields. So within our machine learning model today, we're essentially going to have what's known as an input and an output. So an input is going to be whenever someone types in a new review, and the output is going to be the sentiment rating that the AI model is going to score that. And so for our input today, this is going to be the review text field within our CSV file. So this is, as you'll see in the example to the right-hand window, when I hover over this field, it's all of the text that was in the reviews that had been created. And in this case, I'm just going to need to identify that this is in fact the input text for our AI model. And then our rating field, which was the sentiment score within our CSV, this is going to be what's known as our label. And just like that, that is all we'll need to select. None of the other columns were entirely relevant within this model, so we don't need to worry about those. And now we can select the continue button. And now from the two fields that we had selected, Levity is just going to parse all of that data. So it's essentially just going to run through that and let us know if there's any errors within these fields. And with most data sets, there is going to be some errors. That is completely normal. So if I was to select on this error column here, it's just going to let me know that there are some reviews that do not have text fields. And in this case, I have 858 of those. However, what you'll see is that I have 22,000 valid fields. So these are reviews that contain both text as well as a sentiment label. And look, 22,000 examples is plenty of data to train our model today. So I'm going to choose to save and finalize this. And then Levity is going to take us back to this screen here. And it's just going to take a moment to upload that data set into our AI block. So I'm just going to quickly let some time pass by while this uploads here. And now I am back. In that time, you could have grabbed yourself a quick coffee or even loaded the old Bubble plugin library. However, what you will see now is that the data has been uploaded into our AI block. And now it's visually showing us examples of all of the data points that have been uploaded into it. So you can see here that it's displaying a list of all of the negative reviews that have been uploaded into our AI block. And then of course, if you were to select through, you could open up all of the positive reviews. And then if you really wanted, you could also open up the neutral reviews. And what this is essentially doing is just giving us time to review all of the real examples that have been uploaded into our model. And then it's going to give us the chance to manually change any of the labels on this data if we would like. So let's say, for instance, this review here, if it seemed a little neutral or even perhaps negative, and it wasn't labeled correctly within our original data set, what we could do is actually select the label here and we could update this. So we could make this a negative review or even a neutral review. And what I even love about Levity is the fact that you can select multiple inputs at once. So if I was to shift click on these, you can see I can select all of these data points and I can even update all of their labels by just selecting one here. But to be honest, I'm quite happy with the overall labeling of all of our examples here. So what I'm going to do is just jump ahead and choose to train our AI block. And now this is going to take a little bit of time to train. As you'll see, there is a real-time progress bar here. So once again, I'm just going to skip ahead here so you don't have to sit and watch me breathe heavily for 17 minutes. And once I come back, we will have a fully trained AI model that we can start to test.
A few moments later.
Okay, so I am back and we now have ourselves a fully trained AI model that we can test and play with before we actually connect to our Bubble application. And now, as you'll see here in the left-hand corner, our AI model has a performance score of 84 out of 100, which just means that it has an accuracy rating of 84%. So if you were to feed it a review from an e-commerce store, there is an 84% chance it's going to correctly predict the sentiment analysis for that review. And now when you're working with AI models, anything 80% and above is actually quite good. So I'm actually really happy with how that has performed. Now from here, before we go and actually connect our model into our Bubble application, which I'll be showing you exactly how we can do that in a moment, what I'd like to do is just quickly test and play around with our model, just to feed it some test examples to see how it performs. So what you'll see is we have the ability to enter in an example for our AI model. And so this will need to be a similar example to the training data that we have fed our model itself. So going off the training data we fed the model, which was a list of product reviews for an e-commerce store, I'm just going to type in a product review here. I'm just going to say the dress was damaged when it arrived. I can then choose to run a test of this into our model. And then it's going to give us our prediction scores here. So it is 70% confident that this is a negative review, which is true in this case. And so as a e-commerce store owner, what you could do is just identify all of the reviews on your website that have a negative sentiment, and you could easily find the reviews that need attention. And now one thing I should also just point out is that when you run your first test, this might just take a little bit of time for Levity to spit out the result. And that is just because when your model is brand new, it just takes a little bit of time to fire up the first few examples. So don't worry if it took a little bit of time to give you this result here. What I also might do is just add in a positive example. So I could say, I loved the color of the top. I'll buy from the store again. I will run this test here. And you'll now see that the model is 98% certain that this is a positive review. So it is performing quite well. Now, before we connect our model into Bubble, what I'd love to do is just jump back into my Notion checklist here. I can actually just see we've skipped quite a few steps here without coming back. So I'm just going to tick off that we first of all took the time to configure our data set. So that was where we downloaded the CSV. Then we took a look through all of the data and how it was structured within that. We then created a Levity account. And now we had just completed the process of creating our machine learning model. So within that, we created a Levity AI block. We mapped out all of the data fields. So that was where we identified the text and the label for our data. We then uploaded it. We had the chance to customize any of the labels. We ran the model, and now we had taken the time to test and review its performance, which, as I said, I was quite happy with. Now it's at this point that we can scroll on down and get to the part where if you're a bubbler like myself, this is where you'll start to feel most confident in terms of integrating AI into your Bubble app. And the first thing we're going to do is just connect our model to Bubble, just by using the Levity plugin as well as some API keys. And so if we were to jump over into an existing Bubble app that I have created here, I'm going to talk about what I've set up in a moment. But the first thing I'd like to do is jump over to my plugin tab here. And now I've taken the time to install the Levity plugin, which is a free plugin. If you haven't, what you'll need to do is, of course, just open up the plugin library, search for the Levity plugin, and then install that. And now once the plugin has been installed, you'll just need to make sure you're running the most current version of this, which I am at this point in time. And now, like many third-party plugins, we'll just be required to grab a set of API keys, which is just going to allow this plugin to speak to our Levity AI model. And thankfully, these keys are super easy to find. We're going to jump into Levity here. I'm going to click on the connect button. And now what you'll see is the ability to integrate this with a series of third-party platforms, which of course Bubble is one of those. Now we're not going to click on this Bubble button here because that's just going to direct you to the Levity plugin, which by now you should have installed. Instead, we're just going to open up this API option here. And don't worry, we're not going to be adding manual API calls. Everything is still going to be ran through our plugin, which just means we don't have to write any code at all. But I am going to open up this API here because what you'll find is that we can reveal our own API key, in which case you'll need to copy this. Then we can jump into Bubble here. And before I paste this API key into both of these fields, we're just going to need to structure the way this API key is displayed. And the first thing we're going to need to do is type in the word token followed by a space. And now one thing I do just want to point out is that if you don't follow this step, you'll find that your model isn't able to communicate with your Bubble plugin. So please take the time to type this in the exact same way I have, with a capital T followed by a space. I'm then going to paste in my API key here. And then I'm going to copy this whole API, including the word token. And I'm just going to paste that into my API key development field. And so that way, when I'm previewing our application, it's going to allow our plugin to still connect to our AI model. And now that is how you can create a connection to your overall Levity account. It's as simple as that. And so what I'm going to do is just jump back into my Notion checklist here and tick off that I finished connecting my model with Bubble. And now from here, we can start looking at how we can integrate this model within a Bubble application. And so today I'm going to show you an example of an app that I've already taken the time to create. Because our model was trained on data for a women's e-commerce store, what I've done is I've created an e-commerce store of my own, and I'm just going to walk you through how I've structured my database as well as how I built the UI of that. but it's actually a super simple example. I haven't gone too in-depth in terms of creating an advanced application. I just kept things at the bare minimum. And so if I jump into my Bubble application here, just within my design tab, I've essentially just created the bare bones of an e-commerce store within the top half of my page here. So I just have a header menu, which just contains some text and some icons. None of these are functional, but below this, I've added in a repeating group, which is going to pull and display a list of products I have within my database. Within each repeating group cell, I'm just displaying a product image, as well as the title and the price of a product. And then below that, I have a button which will allow someone to create a review for a product. And now when someone clicks on this review button, I have a pop-up on my page, which is just going to display the product that they've selected. And then it's going to give the user the ability to add a comment as well as their order number. And then later on, I'm going to show you a little bit of an admin dashboard I've created, which is going to allow us to filter user reviews. But before I do that, I just want to quickly show you the basic database structure that I've created for this application as well. So if I jump over into my data tab here, you'll see I have 3 different data types. I have a user. So this is the person who is going to create a review. And for this user, they have a name as well as a profile photo, which is just an image. These are super basic data fields. I then have a product, which for this product, it's going to include just 3 data fields. There's the image, there's the price of the product, which is a number, and then there's the title, which is just text. These are, once again, super basic and straightforward. And then I have a review data type, which is just going to include some additional fields here. So for the review, there's the content, which is just the actual text of the review itself. Each review is also linked back to an original product. So I just have a field here called the OG product. So whenever a review is published, I can tie that to a specific product. Each review also has an order number, so that way a merchant of the e-commerce store could search through their own database to see what that user has purchased within their order, who they are, as well as some additional details about where it was sent. And then finally, I have a field here, which is our sentiment rating. And this is just going to be a plain text field. So this is the field that Levity is going to speak to whenever we create a review. And that's just an overview of my database. As I mentioned, I kept this at the bare minimum to make things super simple throughout this example. The only other thing I should point out is the workflows I've created. I've only created one workflow so far, and that is just when this review button is clicked here. I obviously want to display this pop-up on my page. So what I've done is I've just created 2 steps within this review. The first thing I've done is I've just displayed some data in this actual pop-up. So because I want to display the details of a specific product, so I'm going to have a little image of the product here as well as its name. What I've done in my pop-up is I've just set the type of content to be a product, but I have not given it a data source. So within this workflow here, I'm actually sending a product value through to my pop-up. And then finally, I'm showing my pop-up. And so what I'm going to do is just quickly show you a preview of how this looks with some data I've added into my database. So over in an example here, you'll see that I have a store with 4 products. This store, of course, is nice and responsive. And it's also just displaying the product image, the title, and the price. If I was to click on the review button here, it's going to open up my pop-up. But at this point, I'm unable to click this submit button because at this point, we haven't built out that workflow. Because within that workflow, that's where we're going to speak to our Levity AI model. But as you can see, I kept things as minimalistic as possible here. So if you ever wanted to create a similar example to what I've done today, feel free to follow those exact steps that I have just shown you. But what I'd like to do now is walk you through the process of how we can actually create a review in our database and then have a sentiment rating allocated to that based on what the Levity AI model scores it. So if we just jump back into our Bubble editor here, I'm going to jump into my design tab. I'm going to select on the submit button within this pop-up, and I'm going to choose to start a workflow whenever this is clicked. And now within this workflow, there's going to be a couple of different steps. The first thing I'm going to want to do is create a review in my database. So I'm going to head to my data tab. I'm going to choose to create a thing. The thing I'd like to create is going to be a review. And then I'm just going to need to add some values into all of the necessary data fields for this review. So the first field is going to be the content of the review, which of course is going to be the actual text itself. And now in my pop-up, I have a multi-line input, which is just known as the review. And this field is going to be the actual review text itself. So I'll select its value. Then there will be the original product that this review should be attached to. This is going to equal the value of the parent group's product. So the parent group is our pop-up, which, as you remember in my workflow, I was sending the data of a product from our repeating group into that pop-up. And then finally, I'm also just going to identify the order number. This is going to be the value of the input order number in our pop-up. And one thing I should point out is that there is going to be another data field, which is going to be our sentiment rating. But at this point in time, we haven't yet communicated with our Levity AI model. So we actually don't know the sentiment rating, which leads me to the next step I'm going to add into my workflow. I'm going to click on this, head to our plugins tab, and I'm going to select the Levity classify text action. And now what you'll see is two fields here. And this is where we can send the text we want to classify within our Levity AI model. And so the first thing I'm going to update is the text field here. I'm going to insert dynamic data and have this be the same text added within the new review that was created. So I'm going to select from the result of step 1, its content, which of course is the text of the review. And then from here, I'm just going to need to identify which particular AI block or AI model I'd like to send this text to within my Levity account. And so in order to source the path model here, I'm going to jump into my Levity account. And this is just going to be the classifier ID field here. So I'm just going to highlight this string of numbers. I'm going to copy this. I'll jump back into Bubble and I'll paste that into my model field. And now at this point, we would send the text to our Levity model and it would return a sentiment rating. So what we're going to need to do is make changes to this review that we've just created. And in this instance, we can actually update the sentiment analysis rating. So I'm going to add an additional step here. I'm going to head to our data tab. I'm going to make changes to an existing thing. The thing I'd like to change is going to be the result of step 1 in our workflow, which is where we created a new review. And in this instance, I'm going to update the sentiment rating field. And for the value I'll be storing in this field, this is going to be the value of result of step 2 in our workflow, which is where we had ran the Levity AI model. And now what I want to do is I want to get the predictions most likely label. So this is where it's going to determine what is the most likely sentiment score for this particular text. So I'm just going to select that. And then finally, once we have updated the sentiment rating, the last thing I'm going to want to do is just hide the pop-up as well as reset the values of it for the input fields that lie within that pop-up. So I'm going to add an additional step here. I'll head to our element actions. I'll choose to hide an element. That element is just going to be our pop-up. And then I'd like to reset the input fields within that pop-up. So I'm just going to type in reset and I will reset the relevant input fields. And that is everything we'll need to create into this workflow here. Now, before we run this workflow, what I'd like to just show you is where this data is going to be displayed within my application. So if I jump over into my design tab here and just close my pop-up, what I'm going to do is scroll on down on my page here, and you'll just see I've created almost like a little admin dashboard at the bottom of the same page. So essentially, this admin dashboard is just going to have a repeating group on it, which is going to search through all of the reviews in our database. So whenever someone creates a review, within this, it's going to display the review's content, so the text of that review. It's going to display the review sentiment, the review's order number, as well as the name of the person who created the review, and even the creator's email. And so what I'm going to do is jump over into the preview of my Bubble app here. And if I was to preview this application logged in as a user, as you can see here, what I'm going to do is go ahead and review my first product. So I'm going to click on my review button. I will add a review. I'll say something like, I loved this top. It made me look cute. I can then add in my order number. I'll just add in a random string of numbers. I will submit this review here. It's going to run that workflow and send that review through to Levity. And now one thing I should point out is that if you are running this workflow for the first time, it may take a little bit of time to fire up the model once again. However, at this point, I'm going to scroll on down to my page here. And what you'll see is within my admin dashboard, I can see the review message itself, the sentiment rating, which Levity has associated with this review, the order number, as well as the customer's name and their email address. And while we're here, let's take the time to add in another review. Only this time we will make this a negative review. So I'm going to scroll on up to, let's say, these cargo pants here. I'll leave a review and I'll just have this say something like, the stitching was torn after washing these for the first time. Very disappointed. Would not recommend. I'll then just add in yet another order number. I will submit this review. And if I was to scroll on down to my admin dashboard here, you'll now see that this review, of course, has a negative sentiment rating. And now that is how you can connect your AI model with Bubble and, of course, create a sentiment analysis model. But if you're anything like me, because we can build cool things in Bubble in a fraction of the time, we're going to add another cool feature onto our build here. And that is going to be to filter these reviews by only those that have a negative sentiment rating. So let's say I'm a store owner and I'm getting hundreds of reviews a day, and I only just want to identify all of the negative experiences that people have so I can quickly address them. What we're going to do is we're going to create a workflow that's going to recognize when this button is clicked here. What we'll do is update the data source of our repeating group to only display the reviews with a negative sentiment rating. And in order to do that, we're going to leverage a custom state. And now today, I'm not going to dive into too much detail about how to create that. So if you're not familiar with custom states, I'd recommend checking out my tutorial on how to use those. But of course, I'm going to try and zip through this and explain things in as much detail as I can. So what we're going to do is just jump back into Bubble. And then I'm going to open up the property editor for my repeating group here. And you may remember for the data source of this repeating group, it was just performing a search for all of the reviews in my database. And so what I want to do is use a custom state to just recognize when I want to filter these reviews by the urgent reviews, in which case I'll be updating this data source. So I'm going to close this here. I'm going to select the little information icon, and I'm going to create a new custom state. And I'm going to have this be called display urgent. This state type will be a yes or no option because I'll either want to display the urgent reviews or I won't want to. I'll create this. Now by default, I'm going to set the value to be no here because I don't want to display the urgent reviews straight away. I only want to do that when this button is clicked. I'm then going to close my element inspector and I'm going to create a workflow that's going to set that custom state on my page. So I'm going to click on my button here. I'll choose to start a workflow. And within this workflow, I'm going to set that custom state. So I'm just going to type in the word state. I will set the state of an element. The element is going to be my repeating group reviews, and the state will be the display urgent state that we've just created. And in this case, I'm going to set the state value to be yes. And what I'm going to do is create a condition on this workflow that only allows it to run when the state is currently no. So that way it's going to switch it from no over to yes. So for the workflow trigger, I'm going to add a condition that only allows this to run when the repeating group review, when its display urgent state is currently set to no, this will run. And look, what I'm going to do is update the event color of this workflow to be green, because in this case, we are in fact setting the state to be yes. I'm then going to make a copy of this workflow. I will paste this in. And in this case, I'm just going to want to create a way to then set the state back to no. So on the workflow trigger, I'm going to recognize when the repeating group review, when its display urgent state is in fact currently yes, what I'm going to do is jump to my set the state action, and I'm now going to set this to be no. I'm also just going to click on the workflow trigger and update the event color to be red, because I know that this is the workflow that's going to be turning my custom state off. And now I apologize if I zipped through that, but as I mentioned, I'm not too focused on teaching you how to use custom states today. I do have tutorials for that. But instead, what I want to do is jump into my design tab and now update the data source of this repeating group to only display reviews with a negative sentiment rating whenever the display urgent custom state is set to yes. So I'm going to click on my overall repeating group here. I'm going to create a condition, and within this condition, I'm just going to recognize when the repeating group review, when its display urgent custom state is in fact yes. I'm going to update the data source of this repeating group. And in this instance, I'm going to once again perform a search for all of the reviews in my database. Only this time, I'm going to add a constraint that only displays reviews where the sentiment rating equals, and then I'm just going to type in the word negative. And now one thing I should point out is that this will need to be in all lowercase letters, because that is how Levity is going to send the result back. And that's actually all we'll need to create within this condition. The very last thing I'll need to do is just create a condition on my button, which just updates the text whenever that custom state is set to yes. So I'm going to once again head to my conditional tab. I will define a condition, and I'm just going to recognize when our repeating group review, when its display urgent custom state is in fact set to yes. I will update the text of this button to display the words filter by all. And if I really wanted, I could toggle this on and off to see what that's going to look like. But that is everything we'll need to build. What I'd love to actually do is just jump ahead, create a couple of additional reviews myself, and then I'm going to go into Bubble and I'll show you how this filter is going to function. Okay, so back in my application, I've just jumped ahead and I've created a few additional reviews. I'm just going to move my head to the right-hand side of the screen here. I'm going to scroll on down to my admin dashboard, and you'll see I have a list of all of my reviews. Let's say I want to filter these by the reviews that I need to urgently address. I'm going to click my button here. It's going to set that custom state within my repeating group, and it's going to update the data source to now only display the negative reviews. And of course, I can review all of these, who the customer was, and even what their order number was. And that's just going to allow me as the store owner to quickly triage all of the reviews that need the most attention. If I was to jump back over into my Notion checklist, we can tick off that we've finished integrating our model within our Bubble application. And so I'd of course taken the time to show you the setup for my e-commerce store, as well as how I was structuring things like my database and my workflows. And then finally, we went an extra step further and created a way for us to filter the reviews by their overall sentiment rating. And that actually completes everything I wanted to show you within our tutorial today. As you can see, it's never been easier to create a fully functional AI model without having to write a single line of code using a combination of both Levity and Bubble. And look, that's everything from me in this tutorial today. Of course, if you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources I share, I'd recommend hitting that subscribe button so you can be the first to know when I drop any additional videos. In the meantime though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this course, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.